There are moments of great optimism in human history when a better future suddenly seems possible.
Enormous crowds had gathered outside the House and all over the centre of London to hear the end of the war in Europe officially announced by the Prime Minister.
Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom!
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant.
We now have a charter which guarantees the basic rights and freedoms which each of us shall enjoy as a citizen of Canada.
And then there are moments when hope feels very far out of reach.
Plane overhead, and then all of a sudden I thought it sounded kind of louder, then I looked up, and all of a sudden it smashed right dead into the center of the World Trade Center.
My house is underwater. I have me, my husband, the 3-year-old, and a newborn. So we're stuck with no water, and one of the babies is running a high fever.
Syria's pattern has been to use brutal starve and siege tactics to force rebel enclaves to surrender.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
2020 has had a lot of those moments. As the COVID-19 pandemic drags on and intensifies in parts of our country, a lot of us are searching for reasons to hope. In dark times, hope can be a life raft.
It would be impossible to continue putting one foot in front of the other unless you believe that there's a future which will receive your footfall.
But hope can also be a mirage that keeps us trudging forward but evaporates when we get too close.
My own hope has created this unattainable image of what Canada is and made it seem so easy to integrate into a new country.
Over the next hour, we're going to explore both the benefits and the risks of hope and talk about how we can all hope well in the face of uncertainty and despair.
Do you consider yourself a hopeful person?
No, to be honest. So I consider myself a pessimist who has hope. So it's possible to be pessimistic and so expect worst case outcomes and still have hope that things might turn out otherwise.
For someone who isn't naturally hopeful, Katie Stockdale spends a lot of time thinking about hope. She's an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Victoria, and she specializes in the philosophy of hope, anger, and despair. Katie's forthcoming book is called Hope Under Oppression, and she's going to be our guide during this hour. Along the way, you'll also hear from several other people exploring how the search for hope plays out in their day-to-day lives, in the emergency room, in the climate change movement, in the face of injustice, and beyond. So let's start with Katie Stockdale and a question that may seem simple on the surface, but has a pretty complex answer. What exactly is hope?
There's some consensus that hope involves the desire for an outcome and a belief that the outcome is at least possible. The problem with that definition is that you can desire something, believe it to be possible, and still experience despair. So when I desire a vaccine for COVID-19, I might believe it to be possible, yet I might despair of the outcome. And so we have to think about what else hope might involve. And I think of hope as a way in which we sort of see that possibility of attaining what we desire in a favorable light. And that favorable light is what colors the possibility in terms of something in our working in our favor rather than focusing on the possibility that it won't come about.
So you study both the value of hope, but also the danger. And I want to take those one at a time. So let's start with the value. How does hope sustain us in times of uncertainty and fear?
Hope is an emotion that plays a valuable role in providing benefits to our well-being. So when we hope in times of uncertainty, rather than experience fear or despair, hope involves a kind of feeling that's pleasant, or a sense of comfort and assurance about the way that we can sort of approach the future, whereas fear is associated more with panic, and despair is associated with things like anguish and helplessness. So in as much as all of these sort of emotions are attitudes toward the future, hope seems to be preferable in the sense that it's the pleasant one. It's the one that seems to be beneficial to our well-being in times of uncertainty.
The American poet W.S. Merwin once said, quote, "Our hope is not a thing in the future. It is a way of seeing the present." How does hope change the way we see the present?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think hope, it looks toward the future, but it enables us to act differently in the present. So hope provides a kind of motivation to act in our own lives in ways that might be beneficial in the here and now, and not just in terms of obtaining what we want in the future.
So hope is often a motivating emotion. It can keep people going, sometimes when they have little else. Indrajit Roy is a professor at England's University of York, and he's leading a research project called Citizenship Futures, the Politics of Hope. As part of his fieldwork, he's spoken with people in Bihar, India, one of the poorest places in the world.
They lacked access to drinking water, they lacked access to savings, to income, to full-time employment. But one thing they did not lack was hope. There was always talk about a better future, about trying to do things today so that their children wouldn't have to, suffer tomorrow, about how the world could be a better place. And that really set me thinking about how in the most unlikeliest of places, we find hope emerging, somewhat like a mushroom, if you will. You don't really expect life in some sorts of places, but there you have it. Hope was linked with ideas of a dignified life. So people talked about how their ancestors had been oppressed due to local caste hierarchies, but how over the last 25 odd years, people had begun to find hope. And they had begun to, make their claims as equal members of society, and how they were hoping that the situation would improve for the future generations.
My teachings tell me that I should be thinking 7 generations ahead, because I've had some ancestor, 7 generations ago was thinking about me and my well-being in this moment. And so now I have to think about it 7 generations ahead. Ani Boju, my name is Riley Yesno. I'm from Yamatang First Nation. I'm currently in St. John's, Newfoundland. I'm a writer, a public speaker, and a climate advocate. For me, hope means just something to really keep you going. I think, hope is the only thing that really sustains a lot of our movements.
But Riley acknowledges that it can be hard to find reasons for hope when it comes to climate change.
It's so understandable when people, and I'm one of them a lot of the time, that are grieving so heavily for this future that, we were promised growing up, that we thought we might have, that our kids might have. These are like huge, momentous losses. So it's understandable too, especially now that we've reached a point where, we can't mitigate what's going to happen in so many ways. We now have to adapt. And that's something that is really hard, I think, a lot of the time to be hopeful about, completely justifiably.
And yet, Riley is motivated by the hope that future generations won't live with the same fears that she does.
I want to see something that doesn't, feel so apocalyptic, that we're always living on the precipice of an apocalypse. This climate anxiety that I've grown up with, and I know so many of my peers have too, is something that I don't want my children or my grandchildren to have to feel. And so these are really ambitious goals for sure, but something that I think would be really valuable, this mindset change in terms of seeing the progress that we want to see.
But hope's not always a good thing. Katie Stockdale says that when people's visions of the future are too rosy, it can lead to complacency rather than action.
There are a variety of risks of hope, particularly hope that's sustained in contexts where the evidence is really counting it against us. And we call this hoping against hope, where we hope for outcomes that seem highly unlikely to be realized. And this kind of hope might be beneficial for people's well-being, but that very benefit can also be a risk in the sense that the kind of comfort, assurance, pleasures of anticipation that hope can provide might end up resulting in a kind of dangerous illusion of comfort and the world tilting in our favor when the evidence suggests otherwise. So it can lead to a kind of wishful thinking that things will turn out to be okay, even if they won't be okay. It can lead to complacency. So if I feel as though things are going to be okay because I'm strongly hopeful that things will turn out, then I might not be motivated to act and to make sure that I'm engaging in efforts to make sure that the outcomes I desire will really come about in the future.
If I'm hearing you right, if we're too hopeful, we could be setting ourselves up to fall, from a higher pedestal, from a greater height.
Yeah. So a risk of hope is kind of crushing disappointment and defeat. If we hope for an outcome and that outcome does not materialize, we tend to experience disappointment, perhaps frustration, and that can be crushing. It can be damaging to our well-being and to our perceptions of what's possible in the future to experience that disappointment and defeat. I think it's why some people think we should be cautious in our hopes, that we don't want to set ourselves up for disappointment.
There are a number of philosophers, American Andrew Chignell notably, who drew this distinction between, quote, good hope and, quote, bad hope. What is the difference between good hope and bad hope?
Good hope, I think, is a way in which we hope well. So at the individual level, that means keeping mindful about sort of the here and now and what's realistic. So we can hope, for example, for a vaccine to end COVID-19, but hoping that we'll get one within the next 2 months that will be distributed, that's a bad hope because it's very highly unlikely to be realized and it might be ineffective and it might not be good for us to have. So hoping well or having good hope requires us to sort of shift the target of hope and whether what we're hoping for is realistic, whether what we're hoping for is something that we can actually achieve and that we can take steps toward, rather than falling into the kinds of hopes that are bad hopes that lead to wishful thinking because we're hoping for outcomes that are highly unlikely to be realized.
So that's what it means to hope well. But what does it really look like? For that, let's turn to 3 case studies, starting with Jessica Riddell. She's an English professor at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Quebec, who studies what she calls critical hope.
The reason why I use the phrase critical hope and the importance of the prefix critical in front of hope is to make the concept a little bit more robust and answer some of those cynics who say that it is a soft concept or that it is naive. In fact, critical hope is one of the most robust ways forward into the future. So that critical is saying, you know what, the world is messy, it is difficult, it is complex, but we can navigate it with that hope.
Jessica had been thinking about critical hope for 5 years as a scholar. And then last March, this idea became suddenly and urgently personal.
On March 13th, when all of the schools shut down and my 4-year-old and 6-year-old came home and my husband came home, the same day that the world shifted for us was the day that started on a path of diagnosis and treatment for cancer for my husband. I've been thinking and working and theorizing on what critical hope means and how you can exercise your critical hope muscle And then I was asked to do that in my daily practice, in my daily life, in my home, and navigating that with my husband and my children. I had this moment of thinking, okay, universe, I've been talking a really good game, but now I have to anchor it in practice. And in fact, one of my favorite philosophers around education, Paulo Freire, says to hope alone is to hope in vain. Hope must be anchored in practice. So you have to practice it. You have to exercise it like a muscle. And so the first thing that we did was we had conversations with our children about complexity, about not knowing the answers, and about not knowing what lies ahead, but talking about what was most important for us, which was our love for one another and the hope that Dad was going to get this terrible tumor removed. His lung was going to be fixed. He wasn't going to have pneumonia anymore. And we were going to feel even better than before, acknowledging that we didn't have any of those answers.
But what Jessica could not tell her kids is that their dad was definitely going to be okay. She couldn't tell them when the pandemic would be over. Jessica had to find a way to instill hope in her kids without slipping into something she calls toxic positivity.
I started to think about toxic positivity in the middle of COVID, watching world leaders use narratives about how we're going to get through. We all recognize that toxic positivity. Ça va bien aller. It's going to be fine. Build back better. We're going back to business as usual. We're returning to normal. No problem, right? It's this resistance or refusal to mark a moment of transformation. We're all in the midst of a transformation, and the difficulty of transforming is very real and very material for many, many people.
Jessica cringed every time she heard phrases like "ça va bien aller." At the same time, her inbox was filling up with emails telling her that her husband was going to be okay.
The toxic positivity was, don't worry, he's amazing, he is so strong, he's a survivor, it's going to be great, you're going to be better, back to, better in no time. And that's very nice and very well-intentioned and very well-meaning. But they were very difficult to read in the middle of the discomfort, because you think to yourself, what if things are not going to be okay? And my husband and I really made space for those conversations. Okay, are our wills in order? Are our affairs organized? Do I know how to use the snowblower? The answer to the third one is still no. But we have to have those conversations because we had to imagine an infinite number of possible futures. And for me, that act of planning was hopeful because it covered our bases, it made room for the discomfort, and it invited in the fact that we didn't know what the future was going to hold for us.
Another way to hope well, as Katie Stockdale puts it, is to transform your hope into action. Which brings us to our second case study with Canadian writer Stephen Heighton, the author of Reaching Mithimna, among the volunteers and refugees on Lesvos.
There's a huge difference between what I'd call idle or lazy hope on the one hand and applied or active hope on the other. Idle hope is really just a form of gambling. It's the if only frame of mind where you just hope something will come to pass or won't come to pass, but you don't actually do anything about it. Applied hope is the very opposite. You're actually working in the direction of your hope. And you may even be pessimistic about the outcome, but you're still working in that direction.
At the height of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, Stephen went to volunteer on the Greek island of Lesvos, home to Europe's largest refugee camp. His mom was Greek, and he thought his Greek language skills might be useful.
I think I sum it up about halfway through the book when I'm talking about another volunteer I met there. She was the oldest volunteer in our group of volunteers. She was a 70-year-old American woman. And we were talking about what we were doing there and whether it was a hopeful thing, whether we were really just in the way. And I wrote, Clara embodies a paradox typical of the older volunteers who combine the energy and resolve of optimists with the anxiety of pessimists. We worry it's all in vain, but we act as if we can make a difference. I think that takes us back to that idea of applied or active hope as opposed to idle or lazy hope.
Though Stephen says he's naturally a pessimist, he found hope in the actions of his fellow volunteers and by witnessing the extraordinary efforts of refugees to build a better life.
The Greek word for refugees is prosvigas. Etymologically, it seems to mean something like forward fleers or toward fleers, people who are fleeing toward something rather than simply away from something. Is there optimism in what refugees are doing? Absolutely. The war refugees that I was encountering in 2015 were acting hopefully in that they were fleeing presumably towards something better, but they also had no choice about it.
And that brings us to our third case study in how to find hope with Dani Ramadan. Dani's a Syrian-Canadian author and an advocate for LGBTQ refugees. He fled Syria in 2012 and became a refugee in Lebanon before coming to Canada. And he's lived through moments when hope felt like an impossible goal.
I think there was a period in my life when hope was unattainable, when everything around me was telling me that having a bright future might not be in the books for me. I was a refugee for 2 years, and then I came to Canada, and that seems to be a hopeful moment.
But remember what Katie Stockdale said about the risks of hope. When we build up a glorious image of the future, the gap between our hopes and the real world can prove to be painful.
So for the first couple of months that I arrived here to Canada, during my first couple of months here, I had this honeymoon period where everything is awesome. And I would walk the streets amazed by everything. And everything seemed brand new and golden and shiny and bright. And then after that honeymoon period, you end up realizing the challenges of being in a new home. Challenges that include finding a career and finding a community to belong to and being part of that community. And I started feeling let down, that's for sure, because of my own hope has created this unattainable image of what Canada is and made it seem so easy to integrate into a new country. And then you come here and you face those challenges, logistical challenges and emotional challenges, and you find yourself let down by your own misconceptions about what it means to be part of this country.
Dani learned to find hope by turning inward rather than putting his faith in an external ideal.
I would say that the thing that helped me quite a lot, however, during that time, is that I trusted in myself. I didn't see hope as this bright star on the other side of the universe. I actually had trust in myself, in my abilities, in the voice that I carry, in the uniqueness of my storytelling that morphed within hope and turned it into an action plan.
One reason why Dani is able to have hope for the future today is the life he has now is the one he had hoped for as a teenager.
When I was 15, I was living in Damascus with my family, and the news came on TV, and the Syrian news broadcast were doing a story about the Lambda Awards, which are awards for LGBTQ writers and their fiction. And I remember I was sitting there in the living room with my family, and my family was making fun of the awards. My mother was ticking her tongue. My father was cursing, and everybody was quite negative about it. And in the back of my head, I thought to myself, but I want to win this. This is an award that I actually want to win. And then 2 years ago, my debut novel, The Clothesline Swing, was nominated for a Lambda Award. And that just felt impossibly perfect. It felt like truly the answer to a prayer that happened, 20 years ago. And I hope that one day I will win it, maybe with my next book.
You're listening to the Sunday Magazine. I'm Pia Chattopadhyay, and in this hour, we're exploring the role of hope in our world today. Our guide for it is Katie Stockdale, an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Victoria, who specializes in the philosophy of hope, anger, and despair. Now let's go back to Katie for a look at the politics of hope. As you well know, hope plays a big role in politics. It doesn't matter which politician, what party, what country, they all tend to talk about hope in some context, for better or for worse. What are the dangers of hope being exploited by politicians?
Yeah, so I think that when we think about hope, we often think about it as a really individualistic phenomenon where we talk about having hope in our own lives and encouraging people to cultivate hope. And we miss the ways in which people and institutions in positions of power can sell, offer, and manufacture hope from their positions of power. And sometimes this is not a bad thing. So we might think that the hope of Obama, the hope of Trudeau that we saw in 2015, these might not be necessarily bad political strategies.
Is long. Hope in the face of difficulty. Hope in the face of uncertainty. The audacity of hope.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways.
But other times, hope can be exploited by politicians in positions of power.
We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. God bless you.
So lots of people think that Trump has a politics of fear, and even saying things like real power is fear. But we can also see a kind of subtle politics of hope in there if we take seriously the Make America Great Again message, which is a kind of way in which he might be exploiting the hopes of people by preying on their fears of immigrants, fears of lost jobs, a loss of conservative Christian values, and so on. So that can be quite dangerous when politicians exploit hope to continue in positions of power for their own benefit rather than the benefit of citizens.
African-American poet Marilyn Nelson sees a lot of reasons to be scared of the upcoming American election.
I feel terrified by what I think is a real possibility that this country could be headed for some kind of civil, I don't know, I hate to say the words, but we have a president who will not say he will accept the results of an election if he's not elected. It's a very terrifying time right now.
And yet, Marilyn also sees a lot of reasons for hope.
There is a very strong movement for unity, for human rights. That's not dead. That's still alive. Oh, yeah. It's a bad time, but you have to believe in possibilities.
Marilyn's belief in possibilities comes in part from her own family's history.
I've just recently found my maternal grandfather, who was born in probably the 1880s. His family home was burned by the Night Riders, the forerunners of the Ku Klux Klan, when he was about 6 or 7 years old. The last thing he remembered was his mother saying, "Run north, go north." And he went north by himself. And he got to the Mississippi River and was standing crying because he didn't know what to do. And a white man came up to him and said, "Where are your parents?" And he explained the fire and his mother saying, "Go north." And this man said, "Come home with me. I have a boy your age. You and he can be playmates." This man and his wife raised my grandfather. And I found this family recently, and we've been talking, and it feels like we're long lost, I don't know, like second cousins or third cousins, although we're not biologically related at all. They know the story of their grandfather raised with a black boy who was like his brother. That is a possibility. This country has gone through so many awful things, but there is also the possibility of things like this happening. And I've always felt deep gratitude for my own forebears, for surviving and for producing the line that I am descended from, and for giving us a heritage of hope, of the sense that we will survive, that we will come through this. Individuals whose people have survived the impossible can look back on that impossibility and see that there was, in spite of everything, a way forward. I mean, people who are descendants of Holocaust survivors must have a similar sense that the world turned upside down. Both of those peoples have a history that finally, to the surviving individuals, says, but you survived, you carry this story forward.
I mean, I think that Jews are fundamentally a hopeful people, even though our history would give us little reason to be hopeful. I mean, if we really look at it, slavery and exile, the loss of a homeland, oppression by cruel empires, destruction of the temple in Jerusalem not once but twice, pogroms, blood libels, show trials, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust. I mean, there's a great deal to not be hopeful about if we look at the nature of humanity. And yet the whole of Judaism, though it would take an entire book for me to show it to you, is a set of laws and narratives designed to create in people, families and communities and a nation habits that defeat despair. I think Judaism is the voice of hope in a dialogue between a world as it is and a world as it can and should be. I'm Rabbi Dan Moskovitz. I'm the senior rabbi of Temple Shalom in Vancouver, British Columbia.
To explain the Jewish understanding of hope, Rabbi Moskovitz points to the term tikkun olam.
So tikkun olam is a mystical Jewish concept, the idea that when God created the world, it was perfect, and so perfect that it couldn't contain the essence of God in it, and so it's shattered into shards, and that we had to put those pieces back together. We as human beings are given that responsibility to remake the world. In the midst of a global pandemic and all of its ancillary challenges that are presented, I see tikkun olam at work in the way that our communities, our neighborhoods, our Canadian society is finally recognizing some of the deficiencies that we've had within our social safety net, within the inequalities that are within our country, and addressing them specifically.
For Rabbi Moskovitz, a crucial part of hope is refusing to accept the world as it is.
So, and no matter how improbable it is, we seek our own liberation. And in the story in the Bible, it's miracles and Moses that bring about that liberation, at God's insistence. But we can be the source of miracles in our own lives, and we have been. I mean, the vaccines that are being developed, the therapeutics that are being developed right now with regard to the pandemic, I mean, those are human-made miracles. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of England, had a wonderful teaching. Human beings are the only life form capable of using the future tense. We're the only beings who can imagine the world other than it is and are capable of freedom. And if we're free, if the future is open and dependent on us, then we can know that the beginning of our story is not necessarily the end of our story. And the absence of hope, I think, is to accept our condition as it is and to do nothing. It's to give in to despair.
Katie Stockdale says it's possible to despair about one thing while hanging on to hope in other areas of our lives. But that there's also another kind of despair, one that is all-encompassing and leaves us feeling helpless and defeated.
That particular kind of despair is really risky. It's the despair that makes it impossible for some people, it seems, to form hopes for their own lives and for the future at all. And the kind of despair that we see linked to substance abuse and suicidal behavior. So despair has really, really profound consequences when it's not just about particular things, but about sort of everything in general.
Grappling with despair is something Birgit Amaigbad knows well. As a critical care nurse in Mississauga, Ontario, she deals with people in some of the worst moments of their lives.
Talking about the ICU, there's a lot of need for hope because here you're dealing with families and that see their loved ones in either their last moments of life. We have patients on life support machines, and then we see different family dynamics, some that are hanging on to hope and still believing that things will change. And then we also experience family members that are not coping really well. And in as much as we try not to give false hope to families, but we want to help them to process whatever they're going through in a way that is hopeful. I think hope is a crucial element in my line of work.
As a frontline worker during the COVID-19 pandemic, Birgit has also had to find ways to sustain her own hope.
I was exposed to a COVID-positive patient myself, and that was a time of great uncertainty for me and stress and fear and anxiety. I wasn't sure if I was going to be positive and how things were going to go. So it has been very stressful. But, in all of this, I'm a very optimistic person. And I believe there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. Even with all of that positive thinking that I have, I still have to, wash my hands and take care of myself and take care of the people around me, not put people at risk, do the little things that I need to do to keep everyone safe. In terms of personally, I haven't felt despair because I would say I'm spiritual. I meditate. I have a social support network that allows me to thrive in hope. I try to take care of myself, and also I have loved ones around me that look out for me too. I also try to look out for some of my friends and family members that I know are living alone or don't have that much social support network wherever they live.
And that brings us to another important point. Hope is not just an individual emotion. It's something sustained by our connections to other people and by the collective actions we take. Jessica Riddell, the English professor at Bishop's University, finds hope in her work as a teacher and her interactions with her students.
I believe that teaching is an exercise in hope. You have to live in a world where you can't see the impact that you might have in some distant future that you might never be able to access, and you do it anyway. And then one of the reasons why we go into education is that we believe that improvement and transformation are all possible when we engage in these conversations together and with young people. So when I feel despair, one of the best ways for me to recharge my battery is to plug into the classroom. And I really fundamentally believe that students are at the center of a definition of hope, not just as individuals, as learners, but as a philosophical impetus, because we go in to our classes and are willing to say, I'm going to be different in 5 minutes or 13 weeks or 4 years from what I am now. And for me, that is a tremendous act of courage.
For 21-year-old climate activist Riley Yesno, hope comes from talking to other young people in the movement, especially those younger than she is.
I think the reason why it is so, powerful in young people is because that as we get older, we are so broken down in so many ways by these systems that really reinforce status quo, that I think you lose this feeling that a single person can make momentous change. And so it's really, really hard to keep this really powerful feeling that you have, I think, as a young person about what our capacity as people is for change and what our capacity is as individuals to incite change. It is so clear when I talk to, say, my younger brother, who's about 15 now, that he's like, oh, well, we just have to elect the right person, or we just have to do this and this and this, which, yes, is very, simplified thinking about solutions, but is also indicative of he is very hopeful that there are still these viable avenues for change that we just need to have, the will to pursue. And that to me is really inspiring. I think about when I see young people and they're like, well, why can't we just do this? I'm like, I guess why can't we, right?
And Katie Stockdale? Well, she finds hope in the possibility of working together to build a better world.
So I think collective action can help to generate hope. If we look at the pandemic, or if we look at a movement for justice, or if we look at an enormous moral or social political problem in our own societies or in the world, from an individual's perspective, it looks pretty bleak. But from a collective perspective, if it's the case that we do join together in solidarity and engage in collective action, the space for possibility opens up. What is not possible for me to do as one individual, we collectively can have some control over outcomes that we desire. There's power in numbers, and I think that generates a sense of hope. The reality is we need people to join together in collective action. We need to be jointly committed to a better life and world in order to make it possible. Hope depends upon our actions, and it depends upon our collective actions. It's vulnerable, just like we are.
As poet Marilyn Nelson said earlier, her hope comes from a belief in possibilities. She's seen her ancestors survive the impossible, and she believes there are more possibilities waiting for us up ahead. A spirit she captures in her poem, The Dimensions of the Milky Way. It's about the great African-American scientist George Washington Carver.
He never married. He spent most of his adult life living in a men's dormitory at Tuskegee Institute. I think he had 2 rooms in the dorm. And in this poem, he's sitting and reading in a newspaper the announcement of the discovery of the dimensions of the Milky Way, discovered by an astronomer named Harlow Shapley in 1918. Behind the men's dorm, at dusk on a late May evening, Carver lowers the paper and watches the light change. He tries to see Earth across a distance of 25,000 light years from the center of the Milky Way, a grain of pollen, a spore of galactic dust. He looks around, that shagbark, those swallows, the fireflies, that blasted mosquito, this beautiful world. 100 billion stars in a roughly spherical flattened disk with a radius of 100 light years. Imagine that. He catches a falling star. Well, Lord, this infinitesimal speck could fill the universe with praise.